Good morning, everybody. My name is Cláudia Trevisan. I'm the Executive Director of the China-Brazil Business Council, best known as CEBC, Conselho Empresarial Brasil-China. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our webinar, Sustainability and Innovation on China's Roadmap for 2021 to 2025, organized in partnership with CEBRI, the Brazilian Center for International Relations. I want to thank our sponsor, Bank BOCOM BBM, for making this event possible. The focus of our webinar will be China's 14th five-year plan, which was approved in March and establishes the priorities for the world's second largest economy for the period of 2021 to 2025. There was a reduction in quantitative targets in favor of more qualitative ones. Sustainability and innovation were put at the center of China's strategy in a moment of increasing geopolitical tension with the world's largest economy, the United States. To discuss these issues, we have with us today two highly qualified women. Shan Guo is a partner at Plano, an independent research firm in China. At Plano, Shan analyzes China's economic policies and their impact on industries and companies. Her research areas include industrial policies, regional policies, and state-owned enterprises. Recently, Shan has also been covering China's innovation and climate policies, the topics of our webinar. She has a master's in public administration, economic and political development from Columbia University. Cecilia Machado is the chief economist of BOCOM BBM and a professor at the Brazilian School of Economics and Finance from Fundação Getúlio Vargas. She's a columnist at the newspaper Folha de São Paulo, where she publishes bi-weekly. Cecilia has a bachelor's degree in economics from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, a master's in economics from PUC-Rio, and a PhD in economics also from Columbia University. Welcome, Shan. Welcome, Cecilia. It's a pleasure to have you both with us today. Shan, we will speak for about 30 minutes. After that, Cecilia will make comments and raise some questions. Then we will open to questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask one, please use the Zoom Q&A tool, where you can find it on the lower bar of your screen. I wish we all a great event today, and Shan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Claudia. It's really my honor to speak at this event and to talk about this very important issue. So let me begin by sharing my screen. I have a deck which we can refer to when we discuss China's 14th five-year plan. So here we are. And I'll begin just by adding a little bit word about our company, Planum. We are a newly started company focusing on analyzing China for the foreign investors. And our way of looking at China is we combine the three things about Chinese market together: politics, policies, and economy. We analyze the people making the policies and the policies affecting the economy and the economic realities that policymakers must live with. So let's now move on to the main theme of today's presentation, the 14th five-year plan. For those of you who does not have too much knowledge about this mechanism, this is a mechanism that China develops an overarching plan and to govern China's development for the next 5 years. And the timeline looks like this. We just had the release of the national plan in March. But after that, there will be a series of plans, including some provincial plans, some industry plans to be released in the next 6 to 12 months. So all those plans will set specific targets for the industries that people are most interested in. And after that will be a period of implementation. And at the end of 2023, there will be an interim review of the national plan where officials will evaluate the progress they made and then they probably could make some adjustments to accelerate or change the policy directions. And after that, in 2025, we will have a final review of the 14th five-year plan, the progress, and based on that, we will start drafting the national 15th five-year plan. And it is very important to notice this time is that the 14th five-year plan and the coming 15th five-year plan will be both developed with the 2035 vision in mind. That's the first time that China has this long-term vision, the 15-year vision instead of just a 5-year plan, so that everything will be organized with that vision in mind. And by that vision, China means that it aims to double its GDP by that time in the next 15 years. And that implies a growth rate of 4.7 in the next 15 years. So that will set the underlying principle for China's development. So what will happen in the next 5 years? The plan itself is very long because it's such a huge plan that governs the whole country. But the plan itself has over 150 pages, but it nicely has a summary table that lists all the most important targets up front. And this is this table. So if there is anything you want to take away from this presentation, just this page. And if you look at this table, there are 3 interesting things. One is that there are binding targets, but there are also indicative targets. And if you look through the targets, most of the targets, including the growth targets, are just the indicative targets. Only the environmental targets and the security targets, just the one target a year of schooling here, are binding targets. The binding targets are more important than indicative targets. So if officials fail to meet the indicative targets, they will not be punished. But if they fail to meet the binding targets, their evaluation, their performance will be affected, and that will affect their promotion. So these are more important targets in China's plan. And notably, the security targets are added to the 14th five-year plan for the first time. They were not there before. But the environmental targets have been there since 2005. So China has always been working to deliver the environmental targets, but the economy has been growing so fast that the pollution and the emission problem just is sort of inevitable in the past few years. So the question is whether China can deal with that problem going forward. And that's the first thing, that's the binding targets and indicative targets. Then the second thing to notice is that a lot of the targets were dropped compared with the 13th five-year plan. This is very interesting because people were expecting the 14th five-year plan to have more targets to promote innovation, to promote social welfare, to promote environmental policies, as China committed to decarbonization and other climate ambitions. But this is not the case. And the reason is different. If we look at among the targets that China dropped, these 2 are the most interesting things we noticed. One is China dropped the share of urban hukou as the target, but it kept the share of urban residency as the target. So what does it mean? Hukou system in China is a system that registers your place of residence based on basically the place of your birth. So it's a rigid system that whenever people move to another city, it may not change his or her hukou that immediately. So that was considered a major constraint for people to move across the country and seek better economic opportunities. And when we talk about better economic opportunities, usually we mean people moving from rural area to urban area. So that's why it was one target for China to promote urbanization. But why this target is dropped this time? It is because China has made a lot of progress in liberalizing the hukou system in the past 5 years, but it actually turned out not as effective as policymakers has expected. If we look at the chart on the left side here, the red line represents the share of people living in cities, and the gray line represents the share of people with urban hukou. And you can see that the difference between the 2 are just a constant over time. That means despite China made a lot of liberalization, basically relaxing all hukou restrictions in cities with fewer than 3 million population, like no more people moved because of those relaxations. And this is in one part because the small cities are not that attractive to rural residents anymore, because the Chinese government has granted a lot of benefits to rural residents, trying to address the inequality problem between rural and urban residents. On the other hand, the large cities are not relaxing their hukou, and they cannot do that because it is already very crowded and housing prices have become unaffordable. So the policy goals of urbanization have changed. The Chinese government have now changed to promote people flow across cities instead of between the rural area and the urban area. Therefore, the urban hukou itself is no longer a target. China still sees itself on the way of further urbanization. So that's one important part. And the second part is on the share of the service sector. So this is to many surprise, because the conventional wisdom suggests that if a country develops, it will naturally move away from the industrial sector to the service sector. But recent geopolitical and many other issues to change the view of the Chinese leaders. We had the pandemic, which just convinced the Chinese leaders that the country needs to produce a lot of things for its people to protect its people. And then we had the US-China trade war, and the Chinese leaders believed that China has to protect its own innovation and manufacturing capacity to compete with the United States. So with these two things in mind, the Chinese government is no longer aiming to increase the share of the service sector. It does not want to decrease it though. It's just wanted to happen naturally. And at the same time, the government has put out a lot of policies to support the manufacturing sector. And at some point, the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology even said that it wants to maintain the share of the manufacturing sector. So these two are the most important change in terms of China's 14th five-year plan and its economic development goals. And now let's move on to innovation. So innovation, as Claudia mentioned, many people were expecting China's 14th five-year plan to put a lot of ambitious targets on innovation, but they may be disappointed as well. If you look at the targets, the first thing you will get out of the image, out of the table, is that a lot of the targets were dropped. And all of these targets are just indicative instead of binding. And among the targets drops, the most interesting thing is that China dropped the target on internet access, the penetration ratio. It dropped these targets not because these are not important, but because China has almost achieved, almost made all of its people online. So now we have over 1 billion people having their mobile phones with access to internet. And we have more than 700 million people shopping online already. So this is already a huge amount of people with internet access. So these targets are no longer needed. At the same time, China added the target of share of digital economy and share of valuable patents per a number of people. But these two targets is very difficult to, because on one side, you don't have the 13th five-year plan to compare with. On the other side, these targets, you don't know how to calculate them. They are not calculated. There are no international standards on how to calculate these numbers. So these numbers are very difficult to compare with previous plans, and it's sort of arbitrary to claim whether I make this target or not. And both of them are just the indicative targets. So the media reports have been focusing on the first two targets. The R&D annual growth target is over, China aims to grow its R&D spending by at least 7% a year in the next 5 years. And it aims to increase its R&D as a percentage of GDP to over 2.5 years. So some media have been saying that these targets are very ambitious. They are not. If you look at the left chart, the increasing the R&D share as a percentage of GDP to over 2.5 means that it's basically not changing from the current level. Before, China's R&D intensity, meaning as a percentage of GDP, has always been increasing, but this target means that China is not targeting to increase the share further. At the same time, if we look at the annual growth of R&D spending, the 7% is faster than GDP growth indeed. But in the past 5 years, the annual growth of R&D spending was 11%. So this 7% is a lot slower than the past 5 years. So why is that? Does that mean that China is not going to promote innovation? We believe not. We believe these targets are set with three things in mind. One is that innovation is a very difficult thing to plan for. So that really depends on the smart people making some creative ideas, and you don't know the ideas before they created them. So this is the fundamental reason why innovation is so difficult. And the only thing that government can do is to improve infrastructure for people to develop new ideas. But with the internet access targets already being achieved, there is very little governments can do in the above targets. And another thing is that China has been failing to meet the R&D percentage as a percentage of GDP targets in the past few years. So it is more convenient to set an easy target so that failing to meet the target won't be a problem for the officials. And the third, if many of you may remember, China used to have a plan named Made in China 2025, which triggered a lot of international criticism against those targets set in those plans. So China would want to avoid any similar situations by setting its targets. So it probably would just want to set some easy targets instead of ambitious ones, and let the market to bid instead of setting ambitious targets and then saying, I'm sorry, I didn't make it, or having international community saying that these targets are too aggressive and threatening other economies. So we believe these three contribute to the changes to the disappointment of these innovation targets. However, there is one thing that we need to note in the innovation targets, that is China's plan on basic research. That's something that China made it very clear it's going to accelerate. This is on the right side, the chart here. So in the 14th five-year plan, it says specifically in the body text, not in the summary table, that China aims to increase its share of basic research to 8% in the next 5 years. And the ratio now is 6%. So that means 2 percentage point increase in the next 5 years. Before, we only have 1 percentage point increase in the past 5 years. So that's clearly an acceleration. So China realizes that with the US cutting off key technology supplies to China, China has to develop its own basic research to break through the bottleneck. And also, China stated clearly in the 14th five-year plan that it wants the central SOEs to play its role in innovation. And that is also because a lot of the basic research are done by the research institutes, and those research institutes are affiliates of the SOEs. That's the historical legacy we're having now. So with the government has very clear plan that it actually wants to promote innovation, and it wants to promote innovation by promoting more spending in the basic research and funded by the SOEs. And what's more, so people may worry that, does that mean that SOEs will take over the place? And that the answer is no. It's very clear, because on the left side, you have the data, we have the data from the listed companies in China and all in the manufacturing sector. And it's very clear that SOEs have been underperforming than private companies in terms of innovation. So the ratio here is SOE spending as a share of total revenue. And if you look at these ratios, the private companies are spending 3.5% of their revenue on R&D, but the SOEs are spending only 2.5%. Luckily, both of them have been increasing in recent years, meaning that both firms realize that innovation is critical to their survival and they are willing to invest more in them. At the same time, people may be worried that China's demographic trend, because China just released its population census last month. And the result shows that, one, China is aging quickly, probably earlier than many would have expected. Two, China's fertility rate has been is very low, meaning that women are giving giving birth to fewer babies. So people are very worried about China's demographic trend. But one thing, we acknowledge that challenges, but we would also want to highlight that although the number of people, the population growth may slow, but the quality will continue to improve. So the chart here shows you the share of people with college degree in the total population. Now, 15% of Chinese people hold a college degree. That is a lot higher than 10 years ago, which was only 8%. And it is going to increase in the next 5, 10, 20 years, because China is now having like 9 million or 10 million college graduates every year. And adding to the pool, you probably will have around 20% of this population with a college degree and 30% of this population with a college degree in 2040. And just for comparison, in the US, the share of population with a college degree is around 36. So China will approach the level of the US in 2040. So this is definitely very important for China to continuously push forward its innovation. Now let's move on to sustainability. We all know that President Xi Jinping committed to the world China is going to reach carbon peak in 2030 and then reach carbon neutral in 2060. So how ambitious is that plan? How serious is Chinese leaders about that plan? How feasible is it? And these are all very good questions, and people are looking for answers out of the 14th five-year plan. Unfortunately, there are very few numerical numbers that the 14th five-year plan provide. And one reason is that although the targets are very ambitious, the reality is very difficult. And I'm highlighting the reality here in this slide. On the left side, you have China's energy consumption components. And it's very clear that China is still heavily reliant on coal. It sources almost 60% of its energy consumption from coal, another 20% from oil, another 5% from gas, and another 15% from non-fossil energy. And within that non-fossil energy, only 5% come from wind and solar. Around 8% come from hydro, and around 2% come from nuclear. So with this composition of energy consumption, it's very difficult for China to shift away from coal in a short period of time. It is not because China has not been trying. It has tried very hard. In the past 10 years, it managed to reduce the share of coal from 70% to 60%, so 10% reduction in 10 years. That's already very challenging for China. And if China wants to reach carbon neutral in 2060, that means it needs to reduce the share of coal to almost zero. That's 40 percentage point in the next 40 years. So China must continue with its reduction of coal, and probably even need to accelerate a bit to save some time for any different scenarios. And at the same time, however, if you look at China's potential for renewables, that's on the right side, you have China's map here. The words are probably too small to see, but this is from the 14th five-year plan. And the most important thing to get away from this map is that all these lines, the blue lines and the red lines, means the transmission lines that China needs to transfer the renewable energy producing in one place to where they are consumed. This is because most of China's renewable energy abundant places are the less developed provinces. If you look at the location here, the circles here, it's mostly in the northern part of China, west part of China, and southwest part of China. These places are all less developed provinces in China, but all the energy are consumed along the whole coastal provinces. So this is very difficult. You're producing in one place, but consuming in another place. That means you need massive investment to transmit the energy produced in one place to another place. That was also the problem when China was relying on coal, but coal is something that you can transfer through just the transportation, through cars, through trains. But we're talking about renewables here. The wind and solar is something that you cannot transfer. So what you can do is that you need to build massive grid across the country and produce, transfer the renewables into power in one place and then transmit that power into the coastal provinces. So that is very difficult to achieve. China has plans to address these difficulties in the next 5 years, but that is not going to be any game changer anytime soon. So we still need time. And bear in mind that the 14th five-year plan also named these two, the food security and energy security, as binding targets under the security section. That means that Chinese leaders are very concerned that they need to protect their energy production, they need to protect their energy security, and they won't allow any power problems to happen in the near term. So that will also slow the process for China's green transition. But Chinese leaders are working on it. So what can China do in the next 5 years? The most important things are here. If you look at the left chart, we compare China's emission level with the US and EU, both at a total level and a per capita level. And what you can get out of this chart is that China's emission reduction after 2030, the slope of it will be much steeper than the other two regions. And that means that to avoid any serious problems after 2030, China must start slowing its emission growth so that it will lower the peak as much as possible before 2030. So that means that China will need to start control its emission as soon as possible. It's not going to wait until 2030. So how is it going to do that? It is through these two targets. These are the two remaining targets in the 14th five-year plan under the environment section. All the other targets are de-emphasized, not meaning that there are no targets, they're just de-emphasized, they moved to the body text instead of kept in the summary table. So if you look at the targets, the energy consumption targets per unit of GDP, China aims to reduce it by 13.5% in the next 5 years. In the 13th 5 years, its goal was to reduce it by 15%. So one may be surprised that the 14th five-year plan goal is slightly lower than that in the 13th five-year plan, but it is also because China's economy is going to be slower, inevitable in the next 5 years compared with the past 5 years. So GDP is the denominator here. So when the denominator is going slower, it's just naturally becoming more difficult to control the energy consumption. And that is why the target is lower here. And if you look back, the 12th five-year plan has the target even higher than the 13th five-year plan. So it's just a common practice and natural practice for Chinese government to lower this target a little bit for every 5 years. But in comparison, if we look at this carbon emission per unit of GDP, it kept this target the same as the last plan. This shows, the difference shows that China is shifting to focus onto the carbon emission as a result of President Xi's commitment. And the goal is to reduce that by 18% in the next 5 years. And how is China going to do that? We just said that green transition itself is very difficult for China to do. So what it can do is to change the consumption part of it, because the supply part just requires a lot more investment and time. And if you look at the consumption part, it is mainly industrial sector that contributes to China's carbon emission. The industrial sector contributes to 80% of China's carbon emission, and 50% of that come from electricity generation. That's because of coal. And as we just discussed, it's very difficult to change. But then if we look at the rest, 30% of carbon emission come from the industrial activities, mostly from steel. Steel make up 15% of the carbon emission. And then the cement and glass make up another 10%. And then we have aluminum make up 3%. It's all within here. So if China wants to control its emission, it must target these industries to slow their emissions so that it can control the emission of the whole sector. And that means Chinese government must promote upgrade of the steel sector. And that's exactly the government has been doing in the past few months. And if you notice, the commodity prices has been rising in China for the same reason, because the market believes that the steel will face some supply side constraints while the demand is still growing. And that is going to affect China's economy. That will be the most important factor to watch in the next 5 years. So I'm gonna stop here, and Cecilia, maybe we can discuss some questions, and we can answer more questions from the floor later.
Yes, thank you so much, Shan Guo, for your very insightful presentation. It has covered in depth the main features of the 14th five-year annual plan, five-year plan for China. with lots of details on sustainability and innovation targets for economic growth and development in the country, and particularly highlighting what are the binding and what are the indicative targets that should be met. Raising so many important topics that are of very interest to the Brazilian audience, particularly because China and Brazil are important commercial partners, and looking forward to the plan and how it's going to impact the Chinese economy also has implications for our economy as well. Before I start making some comments, I would like to thank CEBC and particularly the person of Cláudia for inviting me to moderate this session, and congratulate all of those who follow us today. We welcome questions, so please feel free to post them in the chat and we'll direct them towards Shan very shortly. So I'm going to start making a couple of comments on Shan's presentation. And I think in respect to sustainability and innovation, sustainability is the one topic that comes to mind, particularly thinking about the carbon neutrality plan that has been put forward and how it should impact the Chinese economy. I think it's fair to conclude, Shan, that it's a very ambitious plan that should put China in the forefront of sustainable development alongside with other developed countries, as it highlights the importance of high quality green development and innovation investments as the main drivers of economic growth. So talking about the carbon neutrality plan, which you already outlined, I believe the ambition in this plan is the pace at which it intends to implement carbon neutrality in such a short amount of time. So if we look at other countries and in a comparative perspective, we see that this is an unprecedented pace. Even though the US and the European Union, they plan to reach neutrality before China, it has been taking them in this process a lot longer time than China plans to implement the carbon neutrality plan. And so I would like to put two comments and two questions specifically related to the carbon neutrality plan. The first one is related to production in China and transition to this new economy and how the carbon neutrality plan has implications for Chinese economy, but also for global trade and investments, especially taking Brazil into account. As I mentioned, it's one of the main commercial partners. Among exports to China, we have soybeans, and we might discuss a little bit about how these exports might go in clash with the food production targets that are also put forth in the plan for China. But also I'd like to mention iron ore, which is one commodity that is exported. In particular, we've seen commodity prices increase, and there's this discussion that at least in the crisis during the pandemic, Brazil has been performing relatively well considering the huge COVID crisis that the country has faced. And part of it has to do with exports and how commodity prices have been reacting in the aftermath of the COVID crisis and strong demand for commodities. So one might wonder how long this commodity boom will be sustained, in particular iron ore, which is used for construction in China. But as you mentioned, it is compromised by upgrading technology in the steel industry in China. So if you could comment a bit on how you see this transition towards upgrading technology in the steel industry, how it could affect exports from Brazil, and more generally, the whole exports that has been going to China that involves not only iron ore, but also soybeans that could be affected by the food production targets. The second question that I would like to mention, also related to the carbon neutrality plan, is that since the pace is very fast, one can conjecture that it should take a toll on economic growth and inequality. And as I understand, the plan does not put economic growth as a binding target, but as an indicative target. But even though one might question how feasible it is, given that there is a clear trade-off, not in the long run, but I see at least in the short run, on how the economy is going to adjust and adapt to new means of production in the economy. So I would like to ask, how feasible is decarbonization considering other goals of growth and poverty reduction? And one can also think and speculate that there might be room for government willing to step in and help sectors and people that are going to be more impacted by the carbon neutrality plan. And as you mentioned, it seems to me as a big challenge because the total energy consumption comes from coal. It involves targeting a couple of industries like the electricity industry that is going to demand more investments. And we can also think about distribution effects in the economy because these firms, they're going to need to make large investments in infrastructure to adapt to the new restrictions. And in the short run, one can think that curbing the emissions is equivalent to curbing production, and it's going to have impacts on these sectors. So I stop here, and I would like to listen to you, and again, encourage everybody to post your questions to the chat.
Those are all very good questions, and let me address them one by one, although a lot of things are actually overlap with each other, as you just mentioned. The commodity price affects people's income and affects is an inequality issue as well. But so I'll address these questions one by one, but if I missed anything, just feel free to remind me. So I think the first question was on the commodity prices, and particularly iron ore and soybean. And it speaks of iron ore, and we just mentioned the Chinese government has been putting out policies encouraging the steel sector to upgrade its technology. Although the policy looks very, they put out very ambitious targets, but they didn't really specify what kind of upgrade they are looking for. So the 14th five-year plan says that China is going to encourage like steel sector to upgrade 50% of its production capacity, but most of them will be just upgrading the existing blast furnaces. If you look at the more specific plan which is being discussed, it's still being in the draft stage and being discussed with the industry associations, and they're looking at to increase the share of electric furnaces from 10% to 15%. So that's just a small number of increase because China increased the now 90% of the steel produced in China use blast furnaces, and the 90% is already a decline from 5 years ago. 93% of China's steel production use blast furnaces. So if we're looking to increase the share of electric furnaces from 10% to 15% in the next 5 years, that's slightly acceleration from the current level from the past 5 years, but still that's not going to be a game changer. As you said, that requires a lot of investment, that requires the steel factories to completely rebuild their factories almost, and only by that, China can replace its demand of iron ore by other products. You can use recycled steel to put into the electric furnaces, but unless you completely switch to electric furnaces, you still need to rely on iron ore. So that's the basic story here. In the long term, that's definitely gonna change China's demand of iron ore, but we believe that's not going to happen within the 14th five-year plan. However, I think that the iron ore prices has been fluctuating so much that people must be very careful about it. And that is because if we look at the short term, so in May, it jumped by 10% a day. And that was when the Chinese government announced it's going to conduct a production inspection on steel factories to see whether they will be able to reduce production. And that's something that triggered the market rally, and the market believed that the supply side constraint will kick in effect immediately, and that will limit supply while the demand is still solid. So that did not happen immediately, but we believe this expectation is somewhat relevant later this year. This is because towards the end of the year, the Chinese government usually measure the performance of the local government using the energy intensity target and the carbon emission targets I just mentioned in the 14th five-year plan, the bonding targets. They're being evaluated every year towards the end of the year. So towards that time, the local government will have more pressure to reduce emission, and probably by limiting production of steel. And that means if you produce more in early this year, you probably need to reduce more towards the end of the year. So that really will put a pressure on steel production towards the winter, or even probably earlier, the fall time. And around that time, the demand story may also is also subject to some uncertainty. So whether the real estate, the construction activities can last strongly into fall and winter, those are uncertainties that we need to bear in mind. So I think the iron ore prices has this range to, it can still stay high, but it won't go high as much as in mid-May. And probably still stay currently it is probably too low because the market has been adjusting its expectations. But in the near term, it probably will go back to some middle level towards the end year. But that's the short-term view, and the long-term view is that in the 14th five-year plan, the demand for iron ore will stay there. But in the long term, as China uses more electric furnaces, the demand may gradually fade away. But that's really for another like 30, 40 years to watch. And we also mentioned soybean. So soybean is another issue that, as you mentioned, the food production seems to be in conflict with the China's demand of soybean, but that's also going to happen gradually. So the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs just released its plan for the next 10 years. It's an aspirational plan to support development of the industry. It's not anything binding, but that's a useful reference. And there are two things to note. One is that it expects China's soybean import to slow. So in the past 10 years, China's soybean import was growing at like 7% a year in the past 10 years. But it is the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs expects China's soybean import to slow to 1% in the next 10 years, but it's still growing. And if we look at 2030, that's beyond the 2014 plan. But then we need to bear in mind that everything needs to work towards the goal of 2035. So the Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs has a plan for 2030. And by then, the ministry still expects China to import 90% of the soybean it consumes. So basically, the ministry acknowledged that this is something that China has to rely on import. It is going to develop some resources to eventually probably develop some China's own resources, just to in case there is any external shocks, but that will not be the mainstream. China will still rely on importing to meet its domestic soybean demand. So, okay, we just mentioned iron ore and soybean. I think you had a second question which touched on growth and inequality. Maybe, and there we were talking about there are a lot of constraints that China is facing, and we wonder whether that may be a problem that the economy needs to deal with. So I think I have 3 points to explain here. Feel free to jump in if I missed anything. So one is that the carbon plan is indeed very ambitious, but it is also not impossible. I will put it this way: it's not impossible, it's challenging. But what it means is that I just mentioned China has already planning for massive investment across the country so that the renewable energies produced in the less developed part can be consumed in the other part of China. So that's already in plan. And at the same time, the cost of renewables is being lowered quickly in China. So right now, in those provinces where the resources are abundant, the western part and the northern part of China, the cost of generating wind and power, solar power is already about the same level as the coal-fired power, and probably even lower. And the cost of generation is probably slightly higher along the east coast, but it is also coming down quickly. And Chinese government just put out some price guidance on the solar and wind energy, and they are encouraging that this is still seeking industry comments, but they're saying that the price guidance for wind and solar energy is going to be on average 1% lower than coal-fired power. And that's a very ambitious target, and the industry has been pushing back on that, but that's something that government wants to accelerate the price. And that's also feasible because when we look at the history, the wind and solar prices has been coming down quickly. And it's entirely possible that their prices, their cost can be lowered by further 10 to 15% in the next 2 to 3 years. So by then, it will be much more reasonable, cost-benefit effective to use green energy instead of coal-fired energy. So by then, the market will kick in. So when the market kick in and when the government finish its investment on the grid, that could accelerate the adoption of renewable energy. So we just need some transition period this year and next year. And after that, the pace will be a lot faster. So that's on the feasible part. And there's one more thing I want to highlight is that the pandemic actually gave China some room to make difficult adjustments. Because if China does not do anything about it, China's growth is going to be around like 8 to 9% this year. And if you look at the growth target, the 14th five-year plan says that China is going to grow by around 6%. That's about the same level last year. So it's about to grow by 6% a year in the next 5 years. So you have a lot of room to deal with between 6 to 8. That means even if the policymakers do some big adjustments this year, they won't be failing their targets. So they could try a lot of things this year in preparation for further acceleration of the green transition in future years. So that's very important. And in terms of the impact on the economy, it will have different impact on different parts of the economy. And people are mostly concerned about the electricity prices and the commodity prices. And on the electricity prices, I believe the government is trying to use the opportunity to liberalize the electricity market. They have been starting new pilots, and they have been encouraging companies to develop new pricing mechanisms so that to attract more private investments, while at the same time keeping electricity prices low. And this is possible because the grid transmission system is totally state-owned. So you can squeeze profit out of the SOEs to keep both sides prices stable at both sides. At the same time, the commodity prices is also because a lot of the upstream industries is dominated by SOEs in China. So recently, just in the past few days, the NDRC, the price setting mechanism in China, has been holding meetings with the upstream companies, asking them to not engage in speculation of prices, and to be considerate of the downstream companies and to help them stabilize the price. So that's something that Chinese government has room to do. And on the inequality part, still we acknowledge that this transition will affect jobs in the coal industry, will affect probably some industries with heavy emission problems, will affect the downstream industries that has to deal with the price increases. So the government has been putting out some training programs, has been improving the social safety nets for the city residents. That's also one of the reasons that the government is no longer targeting to increase the share of the urban hukou. It is targeting to facilitate the people living in cities, strengthen their safety nets so that they can have a better opportunity going forward. So that's something that Chinese government has been doing, and we'll have to see whether it worked.
Thank you so much, Shan, for your response. We've received many interesting questions. I have a list of them. Maybe we'll try 2 by 2, and we see as we move along in time. So one of them is, in recent years, China has become one of the main foreign investors in Brazil. What will be the impact of the 14th five-year plan on China's investment abroad? And the second one, in your view, how the Chinese environmental policy could favor Brazil in this great transformation?
I think this is actually 2 related questions, and it's so nice that you put them together. In the 14th five-year plan, it actually it doesn't really have a lot in China's overseas investment, but it does has one section, and the key focus of that section is One Belt, One Road. So still, although the media seems to be losing enthusiastic about this plan, it still carries very high political priority in China. And China still wants to make friends with the Belt and Road countries and facilitate their, help them to just improve relationship with China. And how to do that is China still aims to leverage its knowledge on infrastructure and help its partners to improve the trade and the infrastructure needed to improve trade and investment. So ports, railways, the trends, all these will be very important for China to cooperate with its trading partners. And Brazil is, of course, a very important trading partner with China. And as China increase imports of iron ore and soybean, it will need more stronger relationship with Brazil, and probably investing in infrastructure will be one part of it. And in addition to that, I think green transition is another thing that the two countries can find a common ground. This is because I looked at Brazil is very green in its power supply. And it's so amazing that because in China, one thing that people are really headache about is like the seasonality and the volatility of the green energy. They come and go. And China's grid is just don't have the technology to deal with that problem. That's why we actually have a power shortage problem in Guangdong, China's manufacturing hub, because of the instability of the green energy. As the province pushed on green energy so fast, it had to dial back to use some coal to stabilize the power supply. So that's something that China definitely needs to learn from Brazil, and just to deal with this green energy. That would be really helpful.
Perfect, Shan. And just to mention, we are also discussing some possible disruption on power supply and energy supply in Brazil, which has to do a bit with the energy matrix that we have relies on hydropower. But over the past decades, we have diversified the energy matrix to include the possible for thermals to kick in if hydropower electricity is compromised by, as you mentioned, some seasonalities that happen when we have this type of energy matrix. So it's really interesting, this perspective that you've put. So I have two other questions. One on China's biofuel policy. On which specific commodities is biofuel consumption based, and which sustainability criteria apply to the sector? And what are the implications for Brazilian commodities production? And a second question, could the carbon targets end up pushing Chinese steel mills to expand internationally and move parts of its production out of China?
On the biofuel policies, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert there, but from what I see is China's, if you look at China's energy consumption, biofuel makes up just a small portion of that. So I don't think that's a priority in China's policy making right now. And I cannot speak of the criteria because I'm not an expert in this technical treatment. And the other question is about whether China will export some of the heavy emission industries to other countries. I think that will be a commercial decision. So the Chinese government is aware that if this is going to lead the relocation of some factories, it will face international criticism. So the top leaders have been speaking at various events that asking companies not to do that, because they say that the companies need to bear in mind that the climate must be done with the international cooperation. It's not about like you moving from one place to another. You just need to upgrade yourself. It's doable. And as I said, In China, the steel factories, they make up most of the emission, and it's because 90% of them use blast furnaces. And this ratio is much higher than other countries. And there were cases that the Chinese steel factories, they want to move abroad, but the other countries say that your technology is too polluting, I'm not going to accept you. So that's something that China must to deal with it itself. It's not about exporting capacity to other countries. And also at the same time, because of the pressure on these heavy emission industries, China is running short of raw materials itself. So if these factories move abroad, China will have another round of supply chain problems that the government does not want to see. So the best solution for China is still to upgrade its own capacity so that it adopts greener technology to reduce emission.
Thank you, Shan. So in the interest of time, I think we'll have time for two more questions. We've received, again, many interesting ones. So let me go ahead and jump in on them. So about the targets set out in the 5-year plan, how does the government keep track of whether Chinese private companies are in line with the goals set forth in the plan? Is there some group committee within the CCP that carries out any assessment on the private sector? And the other one, what is the vision of the Chinese business community for environmental policy in Brazil? Which points are in favor and which points are negative?
I think I'll address the first question. The checks on the private sector is very interesting because I never think about things that way. It's in China, we don't divide companies into, like, strictly dividing them into SOEs and private companies. If you look at, these are definitely two relevant broad categories, but if you look at the specific companies, most of the companies are mixed. So you have private investments, you have state investment in one company, and each company could differ depending on the shareholdings and on the voting power held by each company. So how the government assign and evaluate targets, the central government develops some targets, and those targets are developed based on the suggestions formulated by the industrial associations and the provinces. So there is a national target. The national target is somewhat assigned to the provinces and industries. And it's not even assigned, it's the provinces and industry develop their own 14th five-year plan, and keeping in mind of the national plan. It's not really like a top-down, strict top-down approach, but it's every part of the economy develop the plan with the central plan in their mind. And it is really up to the provincial and local government to meet the government targets. As I said, the emission control reduction targets, those targets will affect the provincial government officials' performance evaluation. So their performance will be something like, you need to reduce the emission and energy consumption in the city you manage by a certain percentage in the next 5 years. And if you fail to do that, they will demote you, or you will just lose favor of the officials that trying to, you just don't have a chance for promotion. So that's something the Chinese government does. They do not directly give orders to private companies. And I think I missed the second question. Would you mind repeating it?
Yes,
Cecilia,
of course. Yes, I'm muted. What is the vision of the Chinese business community for environmental policy in Brazil? If you think you could point some positive points in favor of the policies in Brazil and negative points as the Chinese community sees it.
I
think you
don't
touched
think
upon
I have,
that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When you talked about the energy matrix, you did touch upon a bit on how China is moving towards a matrix that is similar to the Brazilian one in some sense.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about that, because if you look at China's green mix, it has to rely on hydropower in the near term. The wind and solar is such a small share, and west southern part of China is still like in Sichuan and Yunnan province, they rely on like 70% or 80% of their power comes from hydropower. So they really need solutions to deal with the seasonality.
Mm-hmm. Claudia, do we have time for one more? The last one?
Yes.
Yes, so the last one. How much momentum the Belt and Road Initiative still have? Does it make sense for a country like Brazil to join the BRI?
It's a very interesting question because BRI got so much interest, but it seemed to be disappointing many people. But I think I'll say this, on the economic front, it really is a good thing, but it does not make that much a difference. So even without BRI, China is happy to cooperate with Brazil for its trade relationship, for the investment opportunities. All of these things are just will naturally come together. So BRI is not a prerequisite to enjoy these opportunities. At the same time, China definitely welcome other countries to join BRI. It has BRI in its 14th five-year plan as one of the highest foreign policy priorities. So it still welcome other countries to join, but it is really other countries' decision, depending on its local political atmosphere, to decide whether it wants to join China for, because this is more like a political gesture instead of an economic prerequisite for cooperation.
Okay, thank you so much, Shan Guo, for your very thoughtful response and presentation. We've had a great meeting and learned a lot from you today. Thank you so much. I pass it on to Claudia, who has some closing remarks.
Thank you, Cecilia. Well, we reached the end of our very rich discussion. And on behalf of CEBC and CEBRI, I'd like to thank Shan and Cecilia for their excellent presentation and moderation. I'm sure we all are better informed about China's priorities for the next 5 years after listening to you both. I would also like to thank our sponsor, Bank BBM, BOCOM BBM, for making this event possible. Next week, on July 16th, we will have another webinar in partnership with CEBRI to discuss the scenarios for trade between Brazil and China in 2035. I want to thank the audience for your participation today and hope you can join us on June 16th. Have a great day and thank you again.